Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill, Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor John Flood, who is Professor of Law and Society at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. He is also Adjunct Professor of Law at Queensland University of Technology and Research Associate at the University College London Centre for Blockchain Technologies. He researches on the global profession, globalization of law, and the role of technology in law. Welcome, John.
Hello, thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I want to start with one of your recent papers, Professions and Expertise, How Machine Learning and Blockchain Are Redesigning the Landscape of Professional Knowledge and Organization, in which you say machine learning has entered the world of the professions with different impacts. Automation will have huge impacts on the nature of work and society. Engineering, architecture, and medicine are early and enthusiastic adopters. Other professions, especially law, are late, you say, and in some cases, reluctant adopters. Could you talk about, sort of the landscape of law profession and where they are today in terms of adopting these types of technologies?
Certainly. Law is interesting because it's a very old profession. It's often considered one of the original traditional professions, along with medicine and the church at the time. And in a sense, law has used different kinds of technology, you might say. I mean, all of it's based around writing, and then the printing press and so on.
Yeah.
But it's always been based on a craft, a skill which the individual person has that enables them to do whatever is required, if you like. And so there's never been a lot of room for any kind of automation.
Right.
Certainly there has been space for using people who are not fully qualified as lawyers, who are sort of paralegals, people like that, who will do a lot of repetitive work, document checking and things like that and so on. But what we're getting to now is the situation where automation through machine learning and various other kinds of artificial intelligence is able to start constructing documents, for example, contracts, check documents for particular clauses and things like that, make sure they're up to date. And this, in a sense, is replacing now the kind of work that lawyers will do. So I think in some ways more and more of the profession of law is going to be subject to automation. But the distinction I would make, because I think it's quite important here, is that a lot of what lawyers do is actually quite repetitive. They're drafting contracts all the time, or they're reviewing documents of some sort or another, or they're going through a particular kind of negotiation. And so, a lot of it is the same, but they build up their expertise through doing these same kinds of work over and over again. Right. And what we're now finding is that instead of having young lawyers coming in and doing what we might call the grunt work of checking documents and going through discovery applications where you go through the other side's boxes of evidence to try and decide which are the appropriate documents you want, the emails, the invoices, all of this sort of stuff. Yeah. That is the kind of work which is lending itself to automation. And so that is taking away a lot of the work which was used for training purposes with young lawyers, and is just, and it's doing it much quicker, more quickly, more efficiently in many ways.
And probably less expensive.
Much less expensive. A lot of this work is being outsourced to, legal process outsourcers, say in India or Philippines or South Africa, places like that. So yeah, that's right. And so in some ways, the group of lawyers who do the work which requires the skill and the judgment is reducing in some ways. That pool is getting smaller.
Yeah. It's interesting. The distinction that you make between automation and in my jargon, let's call it decision making, right? Which is, I've done a lot of work on the business side of this. So, for example, in the 90s, in a large pharmaceutical company, so if you think about R&D decisions, people might think it is really complex. There's selection of R&D programs, the design of them, portfolio management, risk management, all those decisions.
Yeah.
Generally in companies, we say, well, senior managers with a lot of experience and intuition make those decisions really well, right? Mm-hmm. And so that statement would automatically imply that machines can really do much there. But what we found in the mid-90s is that a systematic analysis of data make those decisions a lot better, actually, compared to humans. Humans almost always seem to make decisions. These are generally binary decisions. So if you go back and look at it, the alternative experiment has not been run. So we have no data to say it was a good decision or bad, typically. So humans have a 50% chance of making good decisions. So do, just throwing a coin or, letting a monkey make those decisions. So we found that even complex decision making that humans hold, close to their, kind of domain, are not necessarily so. We have machines that could do that much better than humans. I don't know if there's an analog of that in law.
I think there may be, actually. 2-3 years ago, the Royal Society in England decided to arrange a working party on machine learning. And one of the things they did was to put together a round table on machine learning and the professions. And I was asked to talk about that. And I talked about the history of professions in technology. And I think one of the peculiar things that came out in relation to law is that law has always been sort of on its own. If you think about medicine, for example, medicine's always had the teaching hospital. It's an institution that sort of straddles the academic world and the practice world and brings those people together. And as a result, incorporates lots of scientific work and engineering work as well, and computing work and things like that. And that's been the first teaching hospital came into existence in the French Revolution in 1789. So there's a long history of that. If you look at law, there was nothing equivalent to that whatsoever. And there is, in fact, actually a fairly big gap between what the academy does and what the practitioners in law do. So that as a result, as I said before, law has come to this quite late, But what we are finding, I think, is that certainly the management consultants are finding is that because of the nature of a lot of what goes on in a legal office, a remarkable amount of it can be automated. So what we are getting now is companies which are setting themselves up to do this automated work. So we have companies which do nothing but contract construction and formation. A sort of company that a typical lawyer would say to a client, do you want a contract? And the client says, yes, I want a contract, and it's for this. And the lawyer will go away and draft the contract and come back with it. And then if the client comes back again and says, I need another contract, you go through the same process, which is good for the lawyer, but not necessarily good for the client. What we're finding now is there are companies, and I can think of a few of them, that will in fact go into the company and say, look, show us all your contracts. Let's see the entire corpus of contracts that you've got there, and they will analyze them and go through them and say, all right, we can create a new contract in an automated way fairly easily. It may need some modification according to special circumstances, but on the whole, it's fairly standard, and they can do that in a very systematic way, meaning the contracts are reviewed, they're checked. If they're going to expire, then you might need a new one, and they will just, the system will cope with that, if you like. And
yeah. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please go ahead there.
No. So I was just going to say, yeah. So the distinction you make, in terms of education, sort of a systematic graduate level education. That we have, as you say here, is law is in one sense a soft profession.
Yeah.
You say in hard professions like medicine, architecture, or engineering, the state has a strong concern in ensuring that expertise is applied in the public interest, whereas law a little bit different from that, and economics in some sense sort of in the same way. But we have now made economics a really hard science.
Yeah.
Right? Lot of mathematics, lot of analytics there. Whether they are actually useful from a policy making perspective is left to debate, but at least there has been an attempt to make economics a very hard profession. So I don't know what the transformation has been in law.
I doubt very much that will happen in law, although things are beginning to happen. I mean, let me just. One example I learned in that workshop that I mentioned the Royal Society held was somebody from the engineering profession talking about the difference in skills between people who are above 40 and below 40. And he said, if he was above 40, if he was asked to design an airplane, he would take out pen and paper or pencil and paper and do it. And he said, anyone under 40 couldn't do that. They wouldn't know how to do that. They would immediately go onto a computer program and design it there. So you can see there that the incorporation of technology into the academy through to the actual, occupation and firms and things is already standard and there. In law, it isn't. Law, as you say, is still very much a soft skill, although I will argue that there is a difference between the way law is viewed in different parts of the world. So in the United States, law is, I think, more tilted towards the sciences. So law and economics is one of the big things in the US. So you get a lot of people working in the area of law and economics who might go on to do antitrust work, competition work and things like that, which requires a lot of economics and mathematics and statistics and so on. In, say, Europe, Australia, and so on, law is more allied towards the humanities and the classics even. So it doesn't have that kind of scientific underpinning in that way. So anything that's going to change in these parts, if you like, is going to be something that's going to be imported from outside, and it's going to have a very dramatic impact when it does. And I think that's yet to happen. I don't think there's been a sort of Cambrian explosion, if you like, in law. There will be one, I'm sure, But law has an advantage over engineering, economics, and all the other areas you might want. And that's to do with the nature of the rule of law and access to justice. Since the law as a way of ordering society is absolutely crucial to everything else, then law and lawyers will say, well, look, we have a special status here. It's different. Admittedly, if you're an engineer, we certainly want to make sure our bridges stay up. We don't want them to fall down. But, we can design different kinds of bridges. We can design different kinds of legal rules, but there are sort of fundamental rules. If you want to, if you're an engineering company and you want to build a bridge in a different country, you're going to have to do it on the basis of the legal rules, which will be devised by the lawyers according to the countries they're in, and so on. So in that respect, I might put law in a special category, if you like.
Yeah. Let me push on that a little bit, John. So the conference that you mentioned, the engineers under 40 and engineers above 40. So one could argue, from an engineering perspective, one could argue it is actually dangerous to use machines to build an aircraft because all the technologies that we have today actually helps us make that aircraft a lot safer. Granted, if you sit down with a blank sheet of paper and pencil, you might get the principles right. But the technology has advanced so much that you really have to use technology to do it. So, in some sense, engineering is pushed back in a way that, I argue this myself. When I went to engineering school, I had a physics book. And my daughter went to school. She used the same physics book 25 years later. And I argue that is sort of backward because there is really no need for an engineer to really learn Newtonian physics anymore because it is prescriptive, it's deterministic, we can make machines learn it very quickly. And so why spend a lot of time on it, right? So then, if you think about the law field, I wonder if there's a similar argument. That is to say, granted, a very good lawyer has a lot of intuition, a lot of experience to craft something, a contract or a discourse, but then maybe the machines can actually do it even better. We haven't really tested that hypothesis yet, right? We almost have this idea that humans are always dominant over machines, but that may not be true as technology advances. So what do you think about that in the law arena?
It's a very important point, actually, because the American Bar Association has been modifying its ethical rules recently to say that lawyers have a duty and obligation to keep up to date with technology. So we already know that, technology is now an important part. And I have to say, when I say the word technology, I mean this at all kinds of levels, from what you can do with Microsoft Word, for example, and its various plugins, all the way up to artificial intelligence, IBM Watson, or something like that. So that if lawyers become users of technology, whether they're small firms or big firms or what have you, under the ABA rules now, they actually have an obligation to make sure that they are up to date. They can't just say, well, we didn't know what we were doing. So I think in that respect, there is a move. The other move that is taking place is actually the push from the clients. Now, this you have to look at in two ways. One is with corporate clients, the corporations who use lawyers, who have to use lawyers, if you like, want their work done for less money. They want it done cheaper. They want it done more efficiently. They don't want the best piece of work every time. They want something that works, and they want it done efficiently. They want it done routinely, and so on. So it was interesting. I think a few years ago, the general counsel of Cisco actually made a speech saying that he expected his lawyers, the law firms who worked for the company, to be reducing their fees year on year. Now, that's the opposite of what lawyers normally do, which is to raise them year on year. So, so that's one push, which is a very profound push now coming from the clients themselves, who are using, they're beginning to use their procurement departments in the companies and things like that to help purchase legal services. The other aspect, which is just as important in this, is if you look at the role of lawyers and individuals. So if you or I want access to legal services, it's expensive. Lawyers are not cheap. They charge a lot of money. We don't know how to judge the quality of their work and so on, because law is a credence good. We just don't know that. So, and this is where technology can begin to step in and provide services which are efficient and often quite cheap, and work very well for the individual. So in that respect, technology can be seen to be improving access to justice for a lot of people, if you like.
Yeah. So I want to come back to this, John. I think this is a very important point. So when the output has a lot of uncertainty, uncertainty may be not the right term, but it's not deterministic. It shows variability. And so the determination of quality is not as easy as in a hard area like engineering or medicine, right? Business, economics, legal, all sort of fall into that category. And the application of technology sort of has a different meaning there. But I want to touch on one other thing that you say in the paper, and that is, you mentioned this before, and that's about training the next generation. So you say here, regulating bodies or professions are involved in the collection and reproduction of knowledge intended to be used by the entire body of professionals. And so there is an expectation here that, senior professionals is providing their wisdom, their knowledge, their intuition to train the next generation. Now, in a technology-driven regime, this has some implications, right? Our expert is going to be a computer potentially in the future. And so how does that work from a training and knowledge dissemination aspect?
I think this is this is a crucial issue, and it's one which the profession hasn't really got to grips with yet, I think, because if you think of technology in terms of predictive analytics, document review, and things like this, most law schools are not preparing students for this. There may be a course or two on some aspect of technology, but it's not something which lawyers themselves are learning. So I think what is going to happen is we're going to find a blending of skills occurring. So law firms will be, in a sense, having to bring in a range of technologists who perhaps have, skills that straddle both sides of the lines. There will be lawyers like this too, I think. I think we're going to find an avant-garde, a vanguard who will begin to develop skills that allow them to talk to both sides of the line, the tech people and the law people, if you like. And there will be tech people who will acquire and develop these skills as well. But that's still some way down the line. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that, law is still a very highly regulated profession. And the regulators themselves are in the same situation. They are unsure about what is going to happen. And they also feel they have an obligation to not only ensure that, customers, clients, and consumers are protected, but in some ways the profession is protected too, if you like. So, it's a fine balancing act there, I think.
It's a fine balancing act, and it's a changing thing. So going back to, you say here, as an individual attains the status of expert, some form of encapsulation of knowledge and analysis occurs, enabling professional experts to arrive at diagnoses, decisions, and conclusions rapidly. And you make some distinctions around the type of learning that happens in human beings. The distinction between learning to drive and becoming a
Yeah.
chess grandmaster. You want to talk a
Yes,
bit
yes,
about
yes,
that?
because
How
I
those
think
skills?
that's
Yeah.
important. So the principle behind this is that individuals can acquire a lot of knowledge in various areas. So, as I say, learning how to drive a car, you learn how to change gear, you learn what the appropriate speeds and braking for different road conditions and things like that, and so on. If you want to take that further and become a Formula One driver or something like that, then you have to undergo a very different kind of training. And that kind of training becomes a lot more collective rather than individual, because you're going to be in a group that is going to be doing a particular kind of driving, if you like. Everybody in the group has to understand what each other is doing in that group. You can't have people going around a racetrack at 200 miles an hour, all thinking individually, if you like. They have to have a collective consciousness about how to drive in that situation. That's nothing like how you and I might drive. I'm not saying we're bad drivers. I'm just saying it's very, very different. And I think professional work is not that different from this in a way. So once you can go through law school and you can do your law degree and you can learn your law, you can learn your engineering. This applies to all professions, really. But in order to become a professional, in order to become somebody who can operate and function within that particular group, if you like, you then have to develop this collective consciousness. And one way of thinking about it is we can call it kind of tacit knowledge. There's the sort of knowledge you learn on the job from people, which is not always articulated in a precise formulaic kind of way, but is something you pick up from the way somebody does something. You just recognize, that's how they've done that. It might not be, it's probably not written down anywhere or anything like that, but you know, that's different from, X is doing that differently from the way that Y is doing it. And I think X is doing it better. And you can absorb that. That's what I mean by this kind of tacit knowledge. And that comes about from the professional context. And so how the professional context develops becomes absolutely crucial to how you introduce new ways of doing things, new modalities, new skills, new outlooks, if you like. And I think this is where we're on the cusp of this beginning to develop. I mean, we know it's got to be done. Quite how it's going to be done is yet to be determined.
So let me make a statement, John, and I want your reaction to it. So in hard sciences areas like engineering and medicine, expertise is about a consistent application of rules, whereas in law and economics and business in general, let's say, expertise is not about the ability to apply rules, but to deal with exceptions. And if that is true, it has a lot of implications, right? It has implications as to how we might divide work between human and machine in the future, and the skills that universities need to impart on new graduates are also quite different. So I always argued in the business engineering context that universities haven't changed at all. They, like I mentioned before, they're using the same physics books. They've been using the same books for 30, 40 years without asking the question, are those skills relevant anymore? Or more importantly, what skills are really relevant for a human being in the future, right? Do you agree with that expertise is more about dealing with exceptions rather than applying?
That's a nice way of putting it, actually. I can see the logic behind what you're saying. I think what distinguishes a good professional, whether it's a good engineer, a good architect, or a good lawyer, or a good doctor, is somebody who has a certain, this may sound strange, but a certain imagination, creativity about them, a certain kind of flair that allows them to function on the knowledge that they've got and developed over the years, and the experience that they've gathered from repeating what they've been doing over the years and so on. And it allows them to see around things in ways which they perhaps wouldn't have done. I can give you an example, if you like, in law. So in Germany and some other countries, for example, there's a particular way of bundling together mortgage securities. I won't go into detail about this, but there's a statute that enables you to do it, and then you can sell these securities and get money. Now, in certain countries like the UK, the US, and so on, there's no statute. So in a sense, to put this kind of deal together, it couldn't be done, if you like. So a bank came to one of the large English law firms and said, look, we want to replicate this in the UK. We want to set up a market for this. We know the statutes aren't there. What can you do? And what was quite interesting was that the law firm then sort of went back to first principles. The lawyers who were looking at this went back to first principles. They looked at some very basic areas of law, about the law of trusts and contract and what have you. And from that, they constructed an instrument that looked very much like the one in Germany, but without the statute. And they tested it, and it worked. And it turned out to be incredibly successful. So much so that the German government started, and the German legal profession started to complain, because they said, you can only do this by statute. And they said, no, we found a way of doing it through first principles, using law, and there it is. And they were rather shocked by it. But that was a particular example, if you like, of what you were talking about. They took the exceptions, they went back to first principles and said, all right, how will we get, this is where we got to get to, and we're right at the beginning. What are the steps we need to take? And that's what a good lawyer will do, if you like.
Right. Yeah, so that's a very important point. So you say in your paper, John, as Dreyfus and Dreyfus note, the proficient performer immersed in the world of skillful activity sees what needs to be done, but decides how to do it. So as we move into AI and other technologies, I think this is an important point. It is, right from the advent of agriculture, we have been using humans, as you mentioned before, in a lot of repeated activities, which they're not really designed for. Humans, I would contend, don't enjoy doing things over and over again. And if you have a lot of humans doing that, it's because they have to do it for a living, right? And so we should be moving toward a world where anything that is repeated are delegated to the machine, and automation is sort of at the bottom of that. And it's not pure automation. You can have intelligent automation. You can have reinforcement learning, those types of things. So you have some aspects of artificial intelligence getting into there too, and deploy humans, in which they are really good at, in some sense. So we've been studying the brain for ages. We are nowhere close to understand how the heck it does it. It's not deep learning. We see a face 30 years ago. I see that person again. You could have a feeling that you've seen that before. And what the brain has done, actually, not only see that pattern, but also age that pattern intuitively for 30 years and say, yes, that face I have seen before. And so there are some superpowers the brain has. We have been applying them in all the wrong places so far. So the technology might allow us to
think so. Look, I think technology will allow us to do incredibly complex things without having to think about them too much. I mean, if you look at the way a port functions, for example, any major port, these days they've got millions of containers and ships going through them all the time and so on. There's a lot of paper going through there, those charter parties, bills of lading, guarantees and so on. There's a lot of legal work that's being done. And it's all quite standard stuff. I mean, everybody knows what needs to be done and so on. Now, some people are beginning to think, well, the best way to handle a port, if you like, and for everybody to know, is to put everything that's going on in the port into a blockchain, so that you can see the whole supply chain. You can see when something comes in, you can determine when the goods are being offloaded, when they're being shipped. You can start making the payments as a result of the operation of the smart contracts, if you like. And the whole thing could be just run quite seamlessly in some ways without that much human intervention. Really, you just need an oversight and perhaps some bits of coordination and so on. But at the moment, it's still a lot of humans are involved in that. Shipping people, law people, all sorts of things, which is I think insane. That's a waste of resources. We know that there are people who have all kinds of problems that require that creative flair, if you like. And so why waste money on the routine stuff when you could devote the skills to the real need, if you like, in that way.
Yeah. So I want to touch on that a little bit, John.
Yeah.
So blockchain, for example, as you mentioned. So one reason, especially in the professions like law and business, humans have an advantage is this dimension of trust. And at least in our generation, we don't really trust machines at any level, right? So having that human touch is still extremely important for us. Now, technologies like blockchain, for example, actually allows that trust to be potentially decoupled, right?
No, I think you're right. Look, I mean, one of the reasons we make contracts is because we don't trust each other. So, we devise these documents with all the conditions in them, and, what, if something goes wrong, this is what will happen, and things like that and so on. One of the interesting things is that, people rarely rely on contracts. You draw up a contract, and the two business people, if you like, they stick them in the drawer and never look at them again, unless something really, really fundamental goes wrong. But assuming it doesn't, they never look at that again. So you say, well, what was the value of the contract? What did it actually do? If you look at some of the Asian countries, say like Taiwan or parts of China, you have a system called guanxi, which is where people develop effective relationships by knowing each other over a period of time around business that allows them to develop trust, if you like. So, there are different ways of handling trust, but we seem to spend a lot of time on trying to minimize something, which we don't really do a lot of, if you like. So I think one of the advantages of blockchain is that it removes a lot of this from the equation. If there are certain things that can happen, or as a result of if this then that systems, let it happen. And as long as you've got oversight and you can see what's going on, then you don't need to be too concerned about it. It will just do what it needs to do in that way. So, again, that's still very much in the early stages, but we are seeing situations where supply chains, shipping goods from one country to another, can actually be done under smart contracts through a blockchain technology, if you like, and that is now happening. And it's also good for dealing with things like counterfeiting. If you're producing particular high quality goods like mobile phones or particular pharmaceutical products and so on, it's one way of guaranteeing the quality of the product, is you can say, well, look, you can examine the whole supply chain, all the data is there, and here's a QR code, look at it, and you get the whole thing going all the way back. There are issues around that. If you're dealing with the digital, it's much easier. Once you start dealing with physical products, then you have a question of, well, how do you get that first initial digitization of the physical, if you like, that goes on? So there are some people I know here in Australia who run a company called Beef Ledger, which is trying to export beef, Australian beef, to China using a blockchain supply chain, which will guarantee the security and the quality of the goods to the Chinese consumer, because there have been problems with this before. But I will tell you now, doing something like that does require that if the people you are dealing with, you're going to set this up with, you have to have a trusting relationship with them before you can set up a technology that will do away with the trust, if you like. So, we're still in that. That's really early days, I think. There's a lot of time away to go with that.
Right. Yeah, but the technology works. It has, I think it has a lot of potential. One could argue contracts exist because there is a probability of non-performance. If you have a technology that drives that probability of non-performance to zero, then you can actually get rid of all contracts.
Yeah.
At the limit, right? So
it is. And that goes back to that earlier point I made, that, most contracts are fairly standard, routine things. They're there to, in a sense, record a series of transactions and payments that have gone on between people without them having to do much, if you like. Once you're doing the business, the contract just kind of records that in perpetuity. So the smart contract just takes that into a different area and actually does the whole implementation and execution without people having to be involved in that too much, unless something goes wrong. But if it all goes right, then bang, it's done. You don't need to think about it again.
Right. Yeah, I want to jump into another forthcoming paper, Globalization, Law and Lawyers in a Time of Crisis, Introduction to the Global Lawyer. And so in which you say Nikolai Kondratiev, a Russian economist in the 1930s, believed the world's economy operates on long 60-year cycles that he called K-waves. And you say, according to his analysis, we are in the fifth such cycle, which comes from 1980 to 2030. You say it's 2019 forthcoming, John. You might have to go back
I think so. I think so, because I tell you, after what's happening this year, I thought, my goodness, I couldn't. I thought, my God, I've just been astonished, because Kondratiev divides these waves up into what he calls 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And we're in the winter of this 5th cycle, if you like. This is when all the bad stuff happens, and it's war, famine, disease, and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. That sounds, yes, that's exactly right. But one of the interesting things about Kondratiev was that, he because he was one of Stalin's economists, Stalin did execute him, by the way. He got fed up with 1938. That was the end of Nikolai, unfortunately. But he said, instead of, if you like, the ownership of the means of production, being the determinant for the changeover from system to system, he said it's technology, and that technology will drive you out of the downswing of the last cycle into the upswing of the new cycle. And the way that works is that when you're in this kind of winter period, because of the kind of economic gloom that pervades, if you like, people tend to hold back in terms of investment, in terms of technological innovation, and what have you. And so a lot of energy, resources, money, capital, if you like, builds up to a certain point when people say, all right, we've got to go for it. This is it. And that's when, if you like, the technology comes to the fore and really drives it forward. So from that perspective, what he's saying is that, come around about 2030, if things are going slowly now regarding technology, they're going to speed up dramatically in this period. And that's when it will, really all sort of take off. And people have looked back over preceding cycles, and they've, it works, if you like. It's not just a fantasy theory. There are also the people who do cliodynamics in history. These are the quantitative historians, and they've done a similar kind of analysis of historical periods and say, there are these kind of cyclical processes that take place when revolutions occur and big upset occurs and what have you. And one of their perspectives, which I find quite interesting, is that they say one of the reasons for revolution to come about is because elites begin to compete with each other. And I look at, say, Trump in America, and I look at the Democrats, and I would look at, say, Modi in India. I look at Xi in China, and I see different groups of elites who are engaged in a really profound struggle for the future of their countries, if you like, which again is leading to this kind of potential eruption of activity and new ways of doing things.
Yeah, it makes a lot of intuitive sense, John. So one way to think about this is also there are a lot of excesses. So when things go good, there are excesses in the system. People start to believe they're invincible. They change their assumptions about risk because they don't see any. And we see this in financial markets too, right? So these cycles in real markets that Nikolai is talking about, you can see the same thing happening in the financial markets more clearly. But what he's saying is that it happens in real markets. And you ask in this paper in 2019 for, in many ways, globalization is a crystallization of the centripetal economic forces of the last 30 years. Is globalization doomed, as populist Democrats preach nationalism and retrench? And I think we have probably the answer to that. In addition to the COVID shock.
But you see, I think one of the points I was trying to make in this paper was that global law, if you like, is the kind of synthesis of chaos. How do we bring some kind of order to chaos? Now, once you start seeing the undermining of global institutions, you see, Trump has withdrawn from the WHO. He's criticized NATO. He won't have anything to do with the International Criminal Court. And so we've got this kind of real live tension now between an international legal order that's being built up since the Second World War, both economic and legal order, I would say, global order. And so we can't just eradicate globalization. I mean, even with COVID, we can't eradicate globalization. We've got to, handle the COVID pandemic on a global basis. Otherwise, we're lost. If it just retreats to a national approach, it's not going to work, and we'll be defeated in that way. So it's got to be global. One of my questions in that paper was, well, who are the people who are going to be doing this kind of, bringing the order to chaos, if you like? And so I made an argument that it's got to be the global lawyer, if you like. And this is a person who not only understands their own national legal system, but is also able to communicate with lawyers and officials from all around the world, if you like, to be able to develop a kind of common language, a common discourse that enables them to start pulling these things together. And it's not just a simple matter of saying, well, mathematically it works this way or not. It requires a kind of pulling together of people, but it requires that sort of common understanding, which comes out of what I was saying about this idea of tacit knowledge. Once you've got this kind of professional consciousness, you know how other people are going to behave and how they will interact with you. And then that enables you to be able to start to predict how you can do things and so on. And so on that basis, I think we can operate a kind of global order at a sort of below the institutional level, if you like, kind of private ordering as opposed to the public ordering. And that's what will pull us through.
Yeah. Yeah. At the limit, John, I don't know if you think this way. At the limit, one could ask, what is the need for countries? What is the need for legal system differentials? We set this up with the premise that it's easier to manage in small chunks. One could also argue with the advent of technology that you don't need to segment this the way that we have done. Which might make these types of issues,
Yeah, look, I see where you're coming from, and I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, I think there's a whole range of questions that can be handled by the technology, the ones we've got, AI, blockchain, etc., and so on. I don't see any issues there. But there are a lot of decisions that need to be made, both in terms of putting things together, resolving disputes that can only function at a human level, because these are not decisions that are simple binary decisions, if you like. It's not yes or no. It's often a lot more nuanced and complex about that. I mean, one of the resources in the world, key resources in the world at the moment, which is being fought over, if you like, is water. Water is probably one of the most valuable resources anywhere. And it's, you often find that rivers and things like that sort of flow between countries. They form borders. and you've got, people, if you look at the Nile, for example, it starts up in Sudan and then flows all the way down to the Mediterranean. So it goes through two countries or three countries, Ethiopia, and then into Egypt and so on. Well, who has the right to put a dam at a particular place and things like that? All of that has to be coordinated, you see, and that can only be done at a human level. Right. That's what requires the skills in negotiation, judgment, interpretation, understanding, if you like, of the other people. No machine can do that, I guarantee.
Right. Yeah, so before we conclude, I want to touch on one other thing. So in the paper you say, as technology and culture intersect more and more, the ethical conundrums will intensify. We'll be raising questions about the rights and obligations of robots, and go beyond Asimov's 3 laws of robotics into issues of rights of robots and AI algorithms themselves. So this is an area that we haven't really started to even really form some notions around rights of robots and rights of AI as AI gets more sophisticated.
Yes, I do. I mean, I think this is one of the issues. We already know some of the problems with algorithms and are they transparent? Can we see what's going on? And so there are ethical issues around the construction and implementation of algorithms and things like that. But I think looking into the future, we are going to rely on things like robots and various kinds of machines so much more, so that if you look at a country, say like Japan, which has an aging population, such that it doesn't have sufficient younger people to look after the old people who are going to need looking after. So machines are going to be a part of that. And that means people will start forming real relationships with machines. And so that's when I would say, okay, so let's think about how we might sort of view potential rights of a machine. We give rights to humans. Yes, we know that. We give rights to animals now. We've also given rights to rivers and forests in some countries as well. And so machines, I think, are a next logical step. Do we treat them with respect? Let me give you one a very classic example. The production of robots for sex, if you like, is a major industry at the moment. Some manufacturers say they want to program them so that people can act out rape fantasies. Well, do we want that? I mean, should we be, first of all, we shouldn't be having people behave in this particular kind of way. But even and certainly if you do it against another human being, you will be punished for it. And you could say, well, a machine is a piece of property. You shouldn't be doing that. But I'm beginning to think, that maybe machines should be treated with dignity, so that we treat ourselves with dignity. There's a kind of reflexive situation here. What we do to machines, we do to each other, and they may again do to us, depending on how they evolve and move forward in that way. It's a very contentious issue. A lot of people would reject that right out of hand. I agree. I think we've got to start thinking about it and start planning for it, because I think we're going to, at some point, again, I don't know when, but at some point we will be having to deal with that.
Yeah, it's a very important point, John. So if I understand you correctly, the rights to animals, the rights to inanimate things like rivers, the reason those exist is because of its effects on humans. And we can see a very clear link in the future. We would see a very clear link between AI algorithms and robots and their effects on humans. So this is not, it's not fantasy in the sense that, robots should have rights, but rather it's a more conceptual question. If robots did not have rights, it's going to have a negative effect on society.
I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, just to highlight that, if you like, there's a firm called Boston Dynamics that produces robots, and they produce these videos of how these robots are resistant to being pushed over and things like that. And it was quite interesting, because a lot of people say, oh, you can't treat them in this way. This is awful. And so on. Well, all right, I mean, that's anthropomorphizing to the extreme extent. But, I think, on the basis of what you're saying, how we are going to hold human beings accountable to each other in an increasingly complex world, machines have to become part of that. We can't just have them sitting on the edge as though they're not part of who we are and what we are and how we do things.
Right. So in conclusion, John, if you sort of look forward 5 years at the intersection of law and technology, where do you think we will see sort of the biggest impact?
I think you'll see it at two ends, really. I think on the, for the individual, you're going to see a lot of them just interacting with artificial intelligence. So lots of questions about, what are my rights for this? How do I deal with a tenancy agreement? How do I complain against a producer, a company, or something like that? All of that's going to be automated. It's fairly straightforward to do, and it will only need a certain minimal amount of human insight and intervention, if you like. At the other end, if you like, the corporate end, I think we're going to see more and more technology coming in, because, as I say, those basic functions that are being carried out by junior people or paralegals or things like that are the ones which are going to be increasingly automated. Increasingly, we will replace the humans and just let the machines do that, because there's no point in wasting human resources on that. Whether that means we need fewer or more lawyers, that's an open question. I think it will mean that we need different kinds of lawyers. We will need lawyers who are more technologically aware, much more sophisticated. They don't need to be programmers or coders or anything like that, but they need to have quite a strong understanding and grasp of what's going on in technology in that way, if you like. So, we're going to definitely see a lot more.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned this. So from a structural perspective in a law firm, do you see law firms progressing toward group of equity partners
Yeah.
surrounded by machines, so to speak? Or
Well,
do
I
you
think
see that
I
evolving
don't know if it was in that
much more
paper or
slowly?
another one. I sort of forecast law firms as being
Yeah.
distributed, decentralized, autonomous organizations running on a blockchain, with the various people intercepting as and
Yeah.
when they will. No, I think the law firm is still a very strong and powerful institution that's not going to disappear straight away. But certainly the numbers of partners who control things will shrink. That will get smaller as a proportion. And yes, they will be surrounded by more machines, and they will be surrounded by people who are servicing those machines.
Right.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
excellent. Yeah, thanks for doing this on a weekend, John. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you
And
very
good
much. It's
luck
been great fun
with everything that you do.
and very interesting. And I have enjoyed this too. So